5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff.
Hello, space enthusiasts. Welcome to another episode of the Space Business Podcast, where we investigate all the exciting ways in which people participate in the new space economy by conversations with entrepreneurs, executives, investors, and other members of the space family. My name is Raphael, and I'm an investor in and advisor to space companies. Just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational purposes only, and nothing should be taken as investment advice. This podcast is sponsored by NanoAvionics, a satellite bus manufacturer and mission integrator. Their satellite technologies enable many space companies worldwide to offer services that improve life here on Earth, such as providing global connectivity, conducting Earth observation for various purposes, or contributing to scientific discoveries. Check them out and also check out my episode with their CEO and co-founder. Sadly, I am not a rocket scientist, but I'm an alumnus of the International Space University, or ISU, which is also our partner in this podcast. ISU offers a number of educational programs about space worldwide, ranging from executive courses lasting a few days all the way to a one-year master's. Check them out at isunet.edu. On this episode, we continue our quest to get to know space startups around the world. And I'm thrilled that I had a chance to speak to Flavia Tata Nardini, CEO and co-founder of Fleet Space Technologies. Flavia is originally from Italy, but nowadays she's based at the heart of the Australian space ecosystem in Adelaide. Fleet provides satellite connectivity for the Internet of Things, or IoT. So that is the internet that connects, as the name says, things rather than people. This is potentially a big business, and startups aiming to provide this type of service have already raised hundreds of millions. So let's jump into my conversation with Flavia and find out why. Hey everybody, I'm joined today by Flavia Tata Nardini, the CEO and founder of Fleet. Hey Flavia, how are you doing?
Hi, very good. Thanks for having me.
Great, and Flavia is joining us, if I'm not mistaken, from Adelaide in Australia. And
Correct.
So, of course, I was just mentioning to Flavia that this is our second episode in a row that's taking place in the Southern Hemisphere. So we're really trying to cover the Antipodeans here. We'll talk about that in a little while, about the Australian ecosystem for space, which I'm very curious about. But Flavia, why don't you start out giving us the elevator pitch on Fleet?
Fleet Space. So on Monday next week is Fleet's 5th birthday. So we co-founded the company 5 years ago. It was myself and Matt Pearson. Listen, we founded Fleet with a big dream to provide internet from space for the industrial Internet of Things revolution. So what it means is we are creating a constellation of small satellites to connect devices in industries. And these devices help monitoring various things in industries. Constellation of very small satellites, they're called nanosatellites, and they are kind of changing how network is done. So by bringing the cost down of network in the sky, space, we're kind of opening up opportunity for Earth. So yeah, Fleet is 5, very, very soon. So it's been a nice journey so far.
Congratulations. So can you expand a little bit more on that concept of internet in the sky? Because that's obviously something we are hearing a lot these days, partly thanks to our friends at SpaceX with Starlink. But I think, for our, non-technical listeners, which hopefully is a lot of our listeners, because we want a lot of non-technical listeners, they may not know these fine distinctions. And your network is obviously quite different from Starlink's network. So can you go a little more into detail?
Okay. So first of all, space has been changing quite a lot in the access to space in the past 10 years. So when we talk about internet for space, I agree with you, it's kind of a word used a bit too much lately. What it means is that do we have ability to put networks in space to do telecommunication? Okay. Satellites has been historically very expensive, very, very expensive to manufacture, to launch. You're talking about billions of dollars. So it's really literally like a super heavy computer, and that heavy computer doesn't give you the opportunity to give internet to everything. There are two types of internet, two types of comms that are happening in space. One is the internet for people, that what Starlink is trying also to give, and many others. I think there are billions of people without internet access and comms access in the world. And the other one is IoT. IoT is not internet for people, it's internet for devices and for machines. So there are these two big trends. Why space? Because space has changed. And for people that are not in the space industry, what that means is I always talk about that movie Hidden Figures of the beautiful women that helped in the Apollo mission. There was an IBM computer in that movie that was massive. It was as big as an entire room, and it had less capacity of an iPhone than an iPhone.
Yeah.
Space is kind of living a parallel experience from that IBM computer to a small iPad or an iPhone. So big satellites are now becoming smaller and smaller, kind of cutting for hundreds of thousands of times the ability and the cost to put satellite in space. So for non-space people, what's happening in the Internet of Space saga is actually quite fascinating. It's a change that we have seen on Earth already in the computers world. It's just brought to a next level.
Yeah. And I think it'd be useful to understand a little bit, because I think most people listening obviously are, I hope everybody is familiar with the internet for people, because that's been around now, even for the masses, for, almost 30 years, 25, 30 years. But IoT, you mentioned like internet, space internet is an expression that's thrown around a lot. And I think it's a little bit the same with IoT. It's like an expression that is thrown around a lot. But I think people don't necessarily fully understand what it means. It's like, okay, it's internet for things, it's connecting machines, but let's get a little bit more specific. Yeah, exactly. So like, why do we need to connect the machines, and like what kind of machines are we connecting, and why, and how does that make the world a better place?
Listen, I think it's a difficult concept because it is the beginning of the Internet of Things revolution. So we are talking about a vision that is going to happen in the next 15 to 20 years. You mentioned that, Internet for people starts giving us computers and iPhone in the past 20 to 30 years. Realistically speaking, if you were trying to explain to someone, your life is going to change with a computer 40 years ago, probably no one would have believed it, right? Everyone would be like, why? So we are in exactly the same point with the Internet of Things. Is the next industrial revolution. They call it the fourth industrial revolution. It's an industrial revolution that is going to allow industry globally, but also on a personal level in cities, to count on devices more. So I distinguish Internet of Things in two buckets: the normal IoT for consumers and industrial IoT. So when you think about normal IoT for consumers, you think about your connected fridge, your Fitbit, the ability to be in a house where everything is, you say something and things get closed and connected to the internet. You can automate them from your work, and you come home and you got your coffee. So all that amazing experience that we will have in the next 20 years, it will be IoT consumer based. At Fleet, we decided to focus on industrial IoT. And again, it is an industrial revolution. Industry, if you think about mining and transport and, oil and gas and energy, you name it, they've been changed in every industrial revolution. In the previous one, by bringing computers, we can't live without, right? If you got one day I work without a computer, like I'm going to go home, I don't know what I'm going to do today. So IoT is going to do the same. There are a lot of things that are unconnected. If you think, let's bring some example, okay?
Yeah.
If you think about energy sector, the way they operate, with long poles and wires in the middle of nowhere, the people in a car checking things, if there is a fault, if there is an outage and things like that, mining and oil and gas pipelines, all this huge infrastructure that we have in the world are maintained and monitored by people in cars traveling hours. So we kind of reach an efficiency ceiling, and our operations are getting really complicated. During this incredible year that we are experiencing, with people working from home, how would have that happened without a computer, right? You cannot even imagine that the world would have stopped. So it's similar when you need to work everything has to go through a person driving in a car and checking a pipeline, a water line, an energy grid, an agriculture field. The world is a big place. So IoT promise is the fact that we can monitor a lot of things like and water pressure and gas pressure and humidity, environmental status and asset tracking, you name it, to give assets an IP address so that a lot of automation can be done home. And I don't expect everyone to actually understand it. During every industrial revolution, no one was really getting it except a couple of people that jumped on it and say, okay, this is going to change the world. IoT is one of those things. It is going to change the world. It is really hard to understand, but in 20 years, we will not live without.
Yeah, in 20 years, it's going to make all the sense. And I agree with you here. When we are about to go through these big changes, it's very hard to see what's ahead. I mean, we've been talking about the internet for people, right? And I remember, because I'm a little bit older, right? I was at university in the mid 90s, and the internet started, and we all thought this is going to be really exciting. But I'll be quite honest, like none of us imagined like Facebook or Uber or Airbnb.
No.
We're like, yeah, there's like a little bit of email and like really bad web browsing and yes,
check the
Amazon,
weather,
you can buy
maybe.
a book. Exactly. But that was it. And so I totally agree with what you're saying there and sympathize. However, you have given us some examples, and that's great. Like, for example, the agriculture, the energy sector, mining and so forth. So just to flesh that out a little bit more, I guess what that means is, let's take an example from the energy sector. You may have a remote location for energy generation, like maybe a wind turbine or a solar array or something. And like you said, instead of sending people out there, I guess, if I understand it correctly, you would have some sort of fleet sensor on the device, and that sensor would then connect to your satellite network.
Yeah, if you look at energy and all these industries I just mentioned, a lot of their infrastructure are next to us, like really poles and wires and transmission line and distribution lines. But usually energy generation is in the middle of nowhere, and big assets are in the middle of nowhere. So you get to a point that you don't have visibility of anything. Okay, what's the current there? Why we don't have current anymore? Did something cut the line? Did something happen in that station and half of the city is out of power? Most of the operations are quite dark. And so we still rely on people jumping in cars and check. So that create a kind of compound effects of waiting time, people disconnected from critical infrastructure. And why is that? Because if you have to put a sensors on anything, it could be an enormous expensive exercise, right? In Europe, just in the country where you are, there are millions on poles and wires. So now you do an investment to spend like $10,000 per pole to monitor them. You can't do that. Now there's been a big change in technologies, and this is always what happens, in which sensors are going down in price. There are more plug and play, like sub $100. There are satellites connectivity that is low cost, so you don't spend a fortune to connect the sensors, but a couple of euros. And this combination of amazing technology allows you to monitor everything. So you are in HQ, you are drinking a coffee, and you know exactly how your entire assets is performing, why there are faults, what's happening there, without having field services that constantly go here and there. So this is the promise of IoT. And it's happening. So literally you put sensors, there are not fleet sensors. I mean, fleet leveraged a community of sensors ecosystem and is sensors agnostic. But with some amazing technologies, we created an incredible satellite network that allows you to get the data where you want to have it, in the way you want to have it, and act on them. And at the end, it's all about data, I guess, no?
And as you're saying, those sensors are now relatively cheap. You mentioned the sub $100. The other question I had, so if this is in a very remote location, is there any sort of issue with battery life, or do you just take the power?
Absolutely. Battery life is a big problem in IoT, in any form of IoT. There's been new protocols that's been built similar to the GSM that we use for our phones. People in the past 10 years have been building protocols for things. And the goal was reducing the amount of data so that your batteries can last longer. I've got a 8 years old and a 4 years old. I bought them an IoT watch for kids, okay?
Yeah.
And you can just call mom and dad So it's very simple, really cool. The problem is that it relies on Wi-Fi, 3G, 4G, more or less their battery. And this watch does minimal things. Okay, just make a call. That's it. That battery lasts 2 hours.
Wow.
It's crazy. So imagine now you want to deploy hundreds of thousands of sensors in an energy network. Now you need to change batteries every day. Makes no sense. So this industry wants to automate. It's just technology were never there to do so. But now new protocols are completely different from Wi-Fi, GSM has been built. We call them low power wide area networks. So LoRa and NB-IoT. Okay.
Yeah.
And we are leveraging them and say, okay, perfect. These protocols are amazing. That allows you to deploy sensors low cost. The data will get directly to the internet so you can act and your business can change. We're going to provide a satellite solution that is low cost and super smart, super amazing, so that no matter where your asset is, that data comes to your HQ. And this is actually a very complex exercise. I remember when I started Fleet, I was connecting a sensor that was measuring like humidity, like something cheap, tiny, sending a couple of kilobytes of data. And I was spending $1,000 a month to connect via satellites. And I'm like, this can't be. So kind of bringing a lot of software knowledge, a lot of advanced technology. Now we give opportunity to everyone to connect via satellites. It's awesome.
Yeah. And I was just thinking while you were speaking, I was just like thinking myself about use cases. And don't laugh, but the first one I came up with was sort of like, well, this is going to be great for me. Like I will never lose my cat. Like
absolutely.
My cat again because she goes out. And I guess sort of like pet tracking could be a use case because I mean there's many millions of pets in various countries.
In the cities, consumer-based IoT pet tracking is huge. I've got 2 dogs, so I get it.
This is the use case I can immediately sympathize with, and I was like,
also your kids, you want to know where they are. Where are they?
Yes, okay. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. You can see all these amazing IoT city-based, consumer-based changes that slowly we get into our life, up to changing an industry, changing, amazing huge companies. Just inserting these arrays of sensors is pretty cool.
Yeah. Now, the only question when I was thinking about the cat, so, as you know, I'm doing this call from my office right outside of Zurich. So I'm in a relatively like urban area. And it's like, my cat is probably hopefully never going to run away so far that she would really need satellite connectivity. Like, here is pretty dense cellular. I hope so. Here it's pretty dense cellular coverage. So how does that work? Are you guys focused really like on use cases where you definitely need satellite connectivity? Yeah. Or is there some sort of like, interconnectivity between the cellular network?
We have interconnectivity, but we focus on our strength. Like I think 97% of the world is out of GSM. There's a huge world out there, including oceans. So what is covered, I don't think that the satellites will never be faster or better than terrestrial infrastructure. So when there is 3G, 4G, now 5G, of course you count on them. Fleet just gives you that complementary where there is not this type of infrastructure. There are not this type of infrastructure. Yeah. It's quite funny because we have built the 3G, 4G, and now will be the 5G. Very much in the areas of the world where people are, So if you look at the maps of the world, they are all around the cities. And, Europe is quite well connected, but we are in Australia, don't forget Asia, even US. So all the industries and remote communities that have zero connectivity, this is what we're targeting.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense that the traditional cell networks would be focusing on where people live. But like that, there is a number of industries that some of which we already mentioned, like, the mining and energy generation, where really you have to go out into very remote areas. And then so to understand a little bit how that architecture works. So you have the sensor, and by the way, what size should one imagine like these sensors? Is this like book size, like a dime size?
No, smaller, like the palm of your hands, even smaller.
Okay, so you can literally kind of attach that to almost anything.
Yeah, there are different types of sensors depending on application. So it really depends on the application. Usually the way we operate and IoT integrators operate, they enter into an enterprise world and they're like, okay, what would you like to measure if you could? GPS positioning, vibration of machinery, dust, environmental, current, voltage. There is a sensors for everything. These sensors are as very small now. The OEMs are building them all around the world, leveraging this protocol. So it's a big change. So sensors cost goes down, connectivity goes down. You sprinkle some intelligence in it, like AI and machine learning, to allow small sensors as a palm of your hand to act with amazing accuracy. So imagine a mining site, or an hydroelectric plant that they want to automate their operation. So nowadays it's not automated. They would like to apply 1,000 valves, sensors, trackers, 100,000 of things. And there you go. You attach them. Fleet is a kind of a little network. We sell a base station that creates a wireless area around it. So sensors can talk at 20 kilometers radius. It's amazing. So their battery life can last years and years and years and years. They can send data out 20 kilometers. We aggregate data, send it to the satellite, send it to the ground station, send it to an AWS platform, and get it on your phone.
Just answered my next question, because the next question would have been sort of like connecting to satellites. I sort of dimly remember sort of what I studied about what's called link budgets and, how big antennas have to be and things like that. And I also remember like my most direct personal experience with satellite communications, although voice communications, which I understand is much harder than, or much more data, is at some point I went both to the North Pole and the South Pole. And of course, there is no cell network and you need satellite phones. And the satellite phone I had, I think it was an Iridium or Global Star. It was just
that could be
heavy. It was like a brick in my pocket.
I'm sure it was.
So I was like thinking like, wow, how can you get these sensors so small? But I guess there's two things. Like one, you transmit much less data, but also like, I think as you explained now, you actually take two steps. You go from sensor to sort of a base station and then from the base station to the satellite.
Yep.
Okay.
Without having huge, crazy, gigantic things in your pocket, It's good.
Right. And then, so let's continue that discussion of sort of your system architecture. And then you already mentioned about the satellites, of course. One of the most interesting trends in space and why space is so exciting right now is the cost decreases across the board. And what probably people are most familiar with is obviously the sort of the drop in launch costs, that because SpaceX is really using rockets, the launch is much cheaper. Yeah. But as you sort of alluded to, that's what fewer people know. The same thing is really happening with, in space and satellite technology as well, that components and satellites in general are getting much, much cheaper. And I think you mentioned that like historically, like, satellites were very big and could have cost like hundreds of millions of dollars, and they were like the size of a bus or something sometimes. What do your satellites look like? Like how big are they? Roughly how much do they cost? And yeah.
They are as big as a shoebox, a good shoe box, like 20 by 30 or 10 by 40 centimeters. They're tiny. A little bit bigger than a water bottle. The idea there is kind of launching a really big satellite, so a really, really big bird that, bear in mind, as we said, it's $1 billion, but just not that. It takes a long time to build it. Then you launch it into space, and it's there for 40 years using old technologies. It's really hard to build technologies like this. So the whole idea of these small satellites, they're called nanosatellites, is that you can launch them closer to Earth because they are smaller. And instead of launching a very, very big satellite, you launch 100 of small ones. So you can imagine as a space startup how easier it is to get, we all know the concept of MVP in software. And how do you put an MVP in space if you need to build a $1 billion satellite? But when it costs $1 million and it covers all Earth and you can launch them one at a time, one after the other, it's less expensive constellation than the big guy. And also you can increase technology and launch them in stages. It's amazing. So we piggyback. So we launch in real rocket. They get released in the orbit. They have their lifetime, 3 to 5 years, more or less like an iPhone. And then you change them and launch another one. That's how it works.
And part of the reason you can do that, of course, because it's so much cheaper than it used to be. So,
correct.
I mean, it's picking up, you're saying it's the size of a shoebox. So I'm guessing, that's even the entire weight is just going to be a few kilograms, probably, right?
Yeah.
And so now these days when, on SpaceX with what they call the rideshare program, where basically you can send your satellite when they send their own satellites up, it's $5,000 a kilogram. So let's say if your satellite is, like 5 kilograms, it's like $25,000 to launch a satellite to space, which is like ludicrously cheap in a historical comparison.
And so the key for satellites operator is to build very advanced payloads that can fit in that small space.
Yeah.
So you can have very capable satellites, but it's also due to the decrease in size of PCBs and electronics. It's the same trend going from a big computer to a small one. It's happening in space. Right.
Yeah, it's the example you mentioned, like the Apollo era computer that's now less powerful than the iPhone. So in terms of designing your satellites, I guess, where you guys obviously add most value and your technological know-how is in what you mentioned, the so-called payload, right? Which is for the communication, basically the radio. So that I assume you're probably building in-house, but how about the rest of the satellite? Are you doing it yourself, or are you just buying some platform? Because these days there's obviously like a few people around who offer this. We recently had Vitten Nizan, the CEO from Nano Avionics, but there's a number of companies like that now.
Listen, there are numbers of companies. The industry is still at its infancy, but it's getting better and better every year that we speak. Okay. What is interesting about managing a constellation of satellites is that you actually transfer data to customers. So our main objective is we are going to send you data. And we're going to make sure that the data is good, that the data is reliable, and is useful. So Fleet's main business is this, providing IoT data and insights to customers. The technologies that we're building, the radios, are really important. The satellite itself, we decided to work with an American company called Tyvak.
Sure.
That is very similar to Nano Avionics. They build the bus. I think that one thing that is very important for space is being as small as vertically integrated as possible, just for the speed of development. But nowadays, it's terrible to say, but the bus of a satellite is a sort of commodity, right?
Yeah. Sure.
So if you have got budget, you probably can build it. But generally speaking, you better focus on your customers and managing the data flow. If someone else build your bus, it's like the towers of a 3G network, right? So it's pretty fascinating watching what's happening in the ecosystem.
Yeah, you brought up an interesting point about the vertical integration and sort of like, being aware of, where you really add value to your customer. So, and you mentioned, so you're in the business of basically providing that, data to monitor the customer's devices, but sort of like how far down do you go in terms of like, let's say, refining this data? Because let's say when I have, similar discussions with primarily Earth observation companies, there's sometimes customers complaining that a lot of Earth observation companies only provide very raw data. And actually what the customer wants is really refined data for their use case, so they can log in somewhere. Ideally, it integrates with their systems, just like something really user-friendly. How's your thinking on that?
Listen, our thinking is a little bit different from my competitor in the ecosystem. So I've got my view. We decided to work in IoT end-to-end, and also bring smartness in the comms. So we don't send raw data, but we send insights and alerts and information, important information. So one of our biggest IP is a machine learning edge computing. It's an edge computing platform that allows you to actually give to the customers not an Excel of data points, but insights directly in their operations to make decisions. So I'm a big fan of the second thing that you were talking about. So work to make it as much as customer friendly. Sometimes it's easier to work with some partners. Sometimes you have to do it yourself. So that's a bit of a journey. Yeah. If when the community gets better, they can help you in the journey and create that customer friendly. But at the end of the day, an energy operator doesn't really want to know that the current value in that line is 3. They want to know what they're going to do with that information. They don't care. And with Earth observation is the same. Like, okay, give me a photo of my farm. So what? So what am I going to do with that?
So the interesting thing is, and I totally agree with your approach. However, I guess the sort of the challenge that poses is that, like, to the extent you have a number of, viable customer industries, like spanning from, like some of those we discussed, like, energy, mining, and so forth, you would have to almost become a little bit of an expert in each of these industries, either that in-house, or I suppose, like you said, and I guess that's a little bit the model where Earth Observation is going to, you partner up with companies that basically do that step of taking your raw data and refining it for the final customers.
I think when you start building something very new, you need to roll up your sleeves a little bit, but it's not a sustainable model. You can't do it forever, particularly if you want to be a big VC-backed company and become a very high growth company with a product that is easy to use from everyone. But at the beginning, you need to roll up your sleeves and get into the nitty-gritty. I think you have to. You need to create a relevant service. And then once you've understood all the aspects, you can bundle the service and the application or whatever it is, and other people can bring and sell it. But if you don't do that dive in yourself, no one else will do it for you. You need to make your product better, and the experience of the customer needs to be good. But at the end of the day, you have a product, and other people have to be able to put software platforms. So everything needs to be API, and the ecosystem around you needs to grow.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's like very often when you break ground in a new industry, you're actually forced to do the vertical integration, and then maybe over time, hopefully you can outsource part of that. It's interesting. One of our most recent guests was Victoria Alonso Perez, and she's
she's amazing.
Yeah, I love her. For people who haven't listened to that episode, she's basically putting like sensors on cattle and in theory on other animals as well. So I guess we could come back to cats too, but it's primarily on cattle, and then basically that is an IoT application to monitor the health and the movement of the cattle. So she has kind of focused on that second step of taking raw data and like refining a use case for a very specific industry. But just finishing up the discussion on your customers, we actually haven't, or I forgot to ask, we haven't talked about how do your customers actually pay? So is that as usual some sort of like per data, per message revenue model, or how does that work?
It's an recurring revenue subscription model that kind of bundles the entire IoT experience. So it's types of number of sensors. Okay. So if it's, 100 to 500, 500 to 1,000, stuff like that. So it's, for us, the idea is that, the incumbents spend $100 to $1,000 a megabytes. We sell it for 100 times cheaper. Plus, per sensors, we give you the end-to-end experience. Your subscription, they subscribe to a platform called Nebula for getting the data. So it's really a subscription model. And there you go. So make it also simple in terms of price and experience in the payment side. I think it's tricky in IoT, but we're getting there.
Yeah. And then I know this is a difficult question, but then in terms of sort of like, thinking about the use cases and your revenue model, I mean, in a medium-term time frame, how big do you think this market could be?
I think it's huge. Particularly when I can't speak for consumer IoT. It's not my, I just consume consumer IoT and I love it as a person. But industries are desperate for IoT. And they spend millions, if not hundreds of millions, on not automated systems. So they got budgets for entering in fully digitalized automated operations. It's a huge market. So all the biggest company in the world, they will enter in contract of millions of dollars, just to have these things happen. So
yeah. On the other hand, I suppose there's a few other people who kind of believe in the same story, and there's some other companies who are going after the same basically space, like, well, in the broadest sense, IoT, satellite IoT space. It's funny, actually you sit in Adelaide, so I know there's our friends at Mariota who kind of, I think, almost across the street from you. Here in Switzerland, we have Astrocast, there's Kines in France, Hyber in Holland, Swarm in the US. Is there any sort of like natural segmentation to the market, or is really everybody trying to do more or less the same thing?
It's a very interesting question. We were chatting about it with investors 1 hour ago. I think we all started with different visions. Fleet vision, for example, is very, very different from everyone else. Like, we wanted to help terrestrial infrastructure to grow instead of building our own technology. I think in time, the market is speaking for itself of the things that are working or not. low power weather network protocols are growing like crazy. 6 constellation of satellites for IoT, it's insane. So eventually things will come together. The customers need a mix of solutions. So eventually I see that the market will start merging a little bit. The incumbents are really keen to do that. I don't think they are nailing it yet. So it will be interesting to see if there are acquisition opportunities there down the track. What I found interesting is that 4 or 5 years ago, these 6 companies started. And for a series of reasons, they kind of dominate in the IoT space and not other. It's a difficult industry. It's not like building a SaaS model for HR employment platform where you've got 100, 1,000 of them and some always succeed. We now have 6 and they're all moving, So it's fascinating to watch. And there are no new entries because there are a lot of licensing issues and a lot of things that we grabbed that avoid other people to enter in our space. So it will be interesting.
I think it's been interesting as well with those various companies that there has been a lot of investor money flowing into the sector. I mean, some of these fundraisers have been quite big, which I suppose is sort of validation in the sense that investors are also excited about that. But you just mentioned you just had an investor discussion. How has your fundraising experience been?
We've been lucky. Yeah, I think Fleet, we raised with Horizon Ventures, with American investors. We got billionaires in Australia. We got fire behind us. And that's beautiful. Like a lot of visionary, a lot of support, a lot of people that understand the value in industries and IoT. It's I wish success to all of us always during race, because it means that we're going. If they all die, that's not a good sign. You know what I mean? Sure. So the fact that we're all moving, it validates what we're trying to do. Capital raise for a space startup is a journey. I mean, you can meet every investor you want with a space startup, but not everyone will invest. But IoT is well understood. So we are really so customer focused, particularly Fleet is so customer focused that we haven't had major problems so far. Now that we are all approaching Series B, all of us, I think it's starting to be quite complex for investors to understand the differences. And I think what I know is that the real yes or no is in the end of the customers. They will say which services are better and which one bring them more joy.
Yeah. When you say Series B, it's a good moment to kind of actually, because we haven't done this yet, talk about the status of the company right now. Is sort of like, where are you actually in your execution plan? Like, how many satellites do you have up there, and how would that evolve with the raising of a Series B?
So we have launched 4. We are launching other 3. What we are trying to do is get into a point that we want to mass produce satellites. When you mass produce satellites, you just have to be very confident in the payload design and in the bus design. It takes a little tweaks. We have done things very, very fast, I have to admit, and have done so much progress from one satellite to the other. It's not even funny. But that's the idea. That's the idea of the next raise, is that, okay, we're ready. We mass produce. Mass produce is important because of the latency of an IoT network. You want to have as much and more satellites in the sky as possible so you can serve high-quality applications, okay? When your reaction to an issue in the field has to be fast. Also, launching more satellites, you launch more, you go faster. This is what I want to achieve. We've got still a long runway at 1 year to work towards also making sure that all these applications we're working on are scalable and can be reproduced and reused worldwide. And it should be just a no-brainer at that point in time, with the network working, with the sales and customer happy, then we just keep expanding the network.
How many satellites do you ultimately think you're going to get to?
More than 100. 140 is our constellation. But the idea is that you keep launching. Okay. You just keep launching. Keep making money, keep launching. And we really wanted, I think in the competitive space, there's amazing companies and I like them all. I think what Fleet, if you look at what Fleet has got probably different from the other, is probably most amazing payload in the world. And I'm not afraid to say it. But we have been very close to the customer, very close since day one, because we have been using other satellite companies to improve our product. So I feel we are 3 years ahead of everyone. So that's cool.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned, I mean, speaking of competitors, and of course, I wouldn't ask you to comment on any competitor specifically, but you mentioned somewhere a few minutes ago the word incumbents. And so I just wasn't sure what you meant by that. Is that IoT incumbents? Where the only one I
big
could think
satellite
of?
company.
Okay.
Like Inmarsat, Iridium, Opcom.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
They won't do IoT, yeah.
And Iridium arguably is doing IoT, but I guess it's a special kind of IoT, right? It's very specific users. It's relatively high priced.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And they are not shy to say it. This is their business model. This is how they're approaching the problem.
Speaking of specific users and high price and so forth, I mean, so if you're talking about some of these industrial use cases like, again, mining and energy, but obviously another one, I guess, theoretically is the government, right? And like, military in remote locations and so forth, military equipment. Is that also something that's a valid thing and something you're looking at?
Absolutely. I mean, defense is a great customer. The good things about us in the past couple of years, having worked with gas pipelines and water, so all the critical infrastructure, we had to put in place a pretty heavy cybersecurity system here. Otherwise, you don't win any contract. I mean, you are moving industrial data. I think that is getting us quite well prepared for having defense as a customer. When you have defense as a customer, there are a lot of things that change. But it's like SpaceX will not be where they are if they didn't have defense as a customer, right? So It's a great customer to have along the way.
It's actually true for many, many, many space companies. And
I agree, even for Rocket Lab,
Yeah. And then one follow-on question from your fundraising experience. So you also, just a few minutes ago, mentioned Victoria Alonso Perez. So she was the first sort of female space in a broad sense CEO we had on. You're the second one. So I'll ask you the same question I asked Victoria. This is obviously historically relatively male-dominated industry. When I go to some of our industry conferences, you can very clearly see this. How has been your experience being a female space founder, CEO?
I think it's awesome. What did Victoria say to you? I think it's awesome, and I think it has to become the normal. Yeah. And I didn't have any issues. Actually, I think it's a superpower.
Yeah, She didn't have any issues either, so I'm very happy to hear that 2 times in a row. Now, what I will say is, so recently I was on another panel, and in preparation for that panel, I ran my own statistics on our internal database of startups, and we found something like, if you look at C-level executives in space startups, it was like, I think, 85% male. And I was like, okay, we got to change that.
No surprise.
We got to change that. And that's startups, right? That's not established companies, established big old aerospace companies. We have to change that. And then we started brainstorming on a panel how we have to change that. And then really, because so much of the sector is engineering driven, and that's, many years of study, we kind of came back to the point, well, we really have to start changing that at the base, getting more girls into STEM education and so forth. I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that and how we should go about that?
Of course, you need to, I'm talking to you. I've got in front of me a big NASA poster with a female astronaut. So good.
Yeah.
It's a good start to talk about. And of course, you have to get them young. I think all the system needs to work together. But it's a very bizarre topic because, even I got 40 employees and, I can imagine I watch very careful also how many females apply for positions and a balance in the company. And I guess you can imagine it's an important topic for me. And it's hard, man. I think that it's not enough. All my life, I've been one of the few engineers and now I'm CEO of a tech startup, space tech startup. I think it's changing though. And when females come to me, ladies and girls and young girls say to me, it's like, how can I become someone really special in the space industry? I mean, my answer is always the same. Study hard. Own what you know. The world is changed by very smart people and very passionate people, independently from the gender, I've got 2 kids, a 4 and 8 years old. That's not a showstopper either. And so I think empower girls to just study really hard, and just go for it. And having this is happening, though. It's happening. It should happen more.
Great. And, we'll all do our part to kind of keep promoting it more and more. Speaking of, you mentioned your 40 staff. Are you guys hiring at the moment?
We've been hiring last month like crazy because COVID for us was in a really bizarre way. We realized that a lot of amazing people were available in the market, unfortunately for them because they lost their jobs. And Matt and I, we look at each other and say, hey, there's a really good talent out there. And this is what startups are for, to help the economy when these things, hit the world. So we hired lots of people. So last year, this time we were 9, now we're 40, I think. Probably we need to settle down for a second, but it's just amazing to see all this incredible talent that probably in another period it would have been really hard to get, So
this is true. But I'm also very happy because it seems like almost every one of these interviews I do that the startups are hiring. So it seems like the industry has been very resilient, and that's very positive. I wanted to just not forget to talk about a couple of topics. So one which I mentioned at the beginning, you are based in Australia, in Adelaide, which is sort of, I think, the center of the Australian space sector. Because you're the first one from Australia, could you just give us a few minutes, sort of the view of Australia, the space ecosystem? And also, how did you end up in Australia? Because you're originally...
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I'm Italian originally. I was working at European Space Agency, and then, I met the father of my kids, and he imported me in Australia. What is fascinating is that was 7 years ago. When I arrived here, what happened in the past 6 years, very, very cool. And I think the world know about this because they've been observing us in Australia. A couple of startups. So when I arrived, there were no space agency. It was really hard for me to find a job. There were a lot of universities doing space, some of them really. A lot of defense, but there was no commercial space, no startup, nothing. Few people started startups like us, Mariota, and sadly there was Gilmore, that is a rocket company in Queensland.
Yes.
Investors, VC investors started investing good chunk of money, and sadly there was this explosion of revolution in which the federal state says, okay, we're going to space. And, I was part of the group that created the space agency. It's such a honor, for a girl that just arrived, not even Australian. And, and now we got a space agency up and running. Adelaide won the bid to bring the space agency here. When I arrived, there were 2 space startups and one was mine. And now there are more than 100. There have been, 60, 70 million of this investment in 3 years. It's mental. And the government is spending millions and millions for Australian companies to grow. And the approach of the space agency was very clear. We're gonna startups and SMEs to create commercial space. That's it. This is what we're gonna do. So it's pretty exciting. And, we raised money with American investors and they told us, just stay in Adelaide. This is what everything is happening and money are flowing. So you stay there. So I think it's very cool, and way more talent is coming. All the big companies are moving here. So it's becoming a little Houston,
Yeah, I can see that. And then, I'm imagining some of your interesting target industries, like mining, for example, they're very big in Australia anyway. So that's another reason I can think of. I'm also, where would you move to, right? If you move to, let's say, the Silicon Valley, probably the price of your engineers goes up 2 or 3 times. That also doesn't make any sense.
It's amazing how many good engineers there are here. People really love to relocate in Australia. There really is a beautiful country. For us, it was really good for IoT because it's a huge country that based their economy on mining, oil and gas, energy, and is completely unconnected. So being very close to customers now, we are bringing the lesson learned in 5 years. We're bringing to US and South America and so forth. But I think it's a good place to be, I have to say. And also in general, not just space, but the tech. There are a couple of companies that became unicorns in the past 3 years, 5 years. So I think Silicon Valley is having a look at what's happening here, and I like it. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of Australia. A long time ago, I lived in Sydney for a year, so I know all about the advantages of Australia. Wanted to finish up a couple of questions. So you mentioned sort of like other startups. If you were not involved with Fleet, if you weren't doing Fleet, but clearly you are aware of like all of the general exciting macro trends in space that we've discussed, like the cost decreases across the board. What would you be doing, you think, in space? Like if you had to do another startup?
Building Yeah, an airplane that gets you from London to Adelaide in 1 hour. That's a good idea, yeah.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because actually the last episode I recorded was with our friends at Dawn Aerospace from Christchurch, New Zealand. So actually relatively close to where you are, just a few hours flight. And that's I think their medium-term dream. So I very much hear you, like, once this COVID nonsense is over and we all start traveling again, and I would very much like a plane like that myself.
The very fun part that, this thing sounds crazy, but this is not crazy at all. Like how the world changed with airplanes, right? It's mental. Imagine what could happen if Amazon, buy something of, not even thinking about people, but you buy something on Amazon in Italy and arrives in 2 hours.
Yeah.
It's a world that is going to happen. I'm not sure if it's going to happen. If me and you will be still alive. I hope so. But come on, it's amazing.
Yeah, I think the important thing there, and this is a whole separate discussion, and partly it's going to be in the Dawn Aerospace episode, but there isn't anything that I'm aware of, but you're the engineer, that there's no technological impediment. There is, like, we should be able to do that. Of course, it'll take a few years to develop it, but there's no obstacle. Like, there's nothing that we don't know, like, that we have to develop first.
Absolutely, we're going. So, I will do that next. When everyone is, checking what is working, what is not.
Space planes. Good. I like that answer. And then the last question, which is always our last question, is do you like science fiction? So that could be anything, books, TV shows, movies. And if so, any preferences or recommendations?
Listen, it's terrible to say, but I actually don't. But I don't like them. I think when I started Fleet, before that, I didn't really like. I think I watched Star Wars after, because everyone was making fun of me that I didn't watch it. So I'm pretty bad at that. But saying that, I also have a poster of 2001: A Space Odyssey in front of me. I think that was cool.
Yeah.
Yes. That was very, very cool. It's clearly those things had an impact. I just love space movies, fiction. Space movies are good, but if you go into Star Wars and all those sorts of things, I'm not as good.
That's fine. So you're the first one to sort of give that answer, but I'm very happy that there's somebody who gave that answer.
Here we are, Sorry.
No worries. We like less for it. But it's actually funny because even in my last episode, Stefan from Dawn Aerospace, he was already saying, well, not really that much. I prefer the real stories in space and aerospace. And I think there's something you said at the very beginning, or reference at the very beginning of this interview, which was the movie Hidden Figures, about the women who really, behind the scenes, who really in some ways made the NASA, the Apollo program, possible. And I think that is a great movie, and anybody who hasn't watched it should probably watch it. Cool, Flavia, that's it. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. It was very, very interesting to hear about the company, about Australia and the other stories. Wish you all the best for Fleet. I take it you are in the process of raising a Series B, so best of luck with that. And we hope to see more and more of your service come online.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me.
Well, that's it for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider giving it a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. Also consider supporting us at www.patreon.com/Space Business Podcast. If the podcast got you interested in learning more about the business opportunities in the space economy, check out my new online course on space entrepreneurship on udemy.com. The link is in the episode description. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may include yourself if you have an exciting space story to tell, or interested in being a sponsor, drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to seeing you for the next episode.